6,200 wire transfers, 3.7 billion bows, flowing through a single network of companies tied directly to Viktor Orbán's inner circle. That is the number that stopped a Brussels hearing cold. Not a rumor, not a political accusation, an actual audit file compiled by EU investigators sitting locked inside a European Commission cabinet that almost no one has been allowed to see. And when a member of the European Parliament stood up and read those numbers out loud, the man at the center of it all had no answer. The hearing was supposed to be routine, another oversight session on Hungary's compliance with EU rule of law standards, but within minutes the tone shifted. Because MEP Daniel Freund didn't come in with talking points, he came in with a file. The number he read into the record was staggering: 6,200 individual wire transfers,
moving in and out of companies with documented ties to Orbán's government and to members of his closest personal network. And that figure, Freund made clear, represented only what auditors had been allowed to examine. Hundreds of millions more had passed through accounts investigators were never given access to.
Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't scattered spending across decades. This wasn't routine government procurement. This was thousands of distinct financial movements, each one a potential line of investigation, each one pointing to the same place. The hearing room went quiet, because what Freund was describing wasn't just a bureaucratic irregularity, it was a pattern. And patterns like this don't appear by accident. To understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to understand what those funds were supposed to do. The money came from EU structural and cohesion programs, designed to build roads, hospitals and schools in Hungary's poorest regions, meant to close the gap between struggling rural communities and the rest of Europe. Instead, according to the audit documents Freund referenced, enormous portions of those funds moved through a tight network of government-connected contractors, companies that, in several documented cases, had no competitive bidding process, companies whose ownership structures led directly back to individuals with personal ties to the Prime Minister. Sound familiar? Because this is the same playbook used by every government that has something to hide. Give investigators just enough to say you cooperated, keep the most damaging records out of reach, and wait for the attention to fade. But in that hearing room, the attention didn't fade, it intensified. Freund continued reading. He described how the transfer records showed money cycling through intermediary entities before arriving at final destinations that investigators were still trying to map. He described how several of those entities had been registered only months before receiving their first major government contract. He described how their ownership, in multiple cases, could be traced back through layers of nominees to individuals who appeared in the Prime Minister's personal correspondence. And if a sitting MEP with full committee access is being told to stop asking, what does that say about the chances of an ordinary Hungarian citizen ever seeing what is inside those records? At the center of this silence is a name that cannot be avoided: Viktor Orbán. Not because accusations against him have been proven in court. They have not. But because the financial network under scrutiny did not build itself. Because the contractors who received those funds did not select themselves. Because the systematic pattern of obstruction stretches across every institution that his government controls. This is not the story of one bad procurement decision. This is the story of a system. A system designed not to govern for the people, but to govern for the network. And the $3.7 billion figure is not the ceiling of that story. According to investigators who have seen partial records, it may barely be the floor. Consider what that money was supposed to do for Hungary. The hospitals that were never properly equipped, the rural roads that were budgeted and never built to standard, the schools in eastern Hungary that received EU funding on paper and deteriorating classrooms in reality. Consider the communities that watched EU money arrive in their region and somehow never arrive in their lives. And then consider that when investigators tried to follow that money, they were handed incomplete records. When parliamentarians requested the full file, they were told it was already available. When journalists filed access requests, they were denied. When whistleblowers raised alarms, they found themselves reassigned or dismissed. These are not coincidences. These are choices, deliberate choices made at the highest levels to keep the full picture out of view. What we witnessed in that hearing was not just a political confrontation. It was a moment where the gap between official narrative and documented reality became impossible to paper over. One side had a file, the other side had deflections, and anyone watching could see exactly which was which. The fight over Hungary's EU funds is not over. The audit records still exist. The transfer logs still exist. The truth still exists. The only question is whether enough pressure will be sustained to force it into daylight. Because once that file is fully public, once those 6,200 transfers can be traced end to end, the names attached to them will not be easy to erase. That is why the resistance has been so consistent. That is why the file stays locked, not because it is irrelevant, but because it is explosive. The money trail exists, the documents exist, the pattern exists. The only thing missing is the will to follow it to the end. When you follow the money, you follow the truth. And right now, the truth is still locked inside a Brussels cabinet. The only real question is how much longer the public will allow it to stay there. And that question matters more now than it ever has. Because the pattern isn't just financial. It extends into every corner of Hungarian public life that Orbán's government has touched over 15 years in power. The courts, the press, the universities, the civil society organizations that were quietly defunded, legislated out of existence, or driven out of the country entirely. Each piece of that picture, taken alone, could be explained away. Together, they form something that cannot be dismissed. Think about what happened to Hungary's independent media. One by one, outlets that asked difficult questions were acquired by government-friendly ownership groups. By the time the process was complete, a single pro-government media network controlled the majority of local newspapers, national television channels, and online news platforms. All of it concentrated, all of it pointing in the same direction. And if you want to understand how that happened financially, you have to look at the same network of companies that Freund's file is about. Because the money that built Hungary's media empire didn't appear from nowhere. It followed the same channels, the same intermediaries, the same ownership layers. That is what makes the audit file so significant. It isn't just about construction contracts or infrastructure projects. It is about how a network consolidates power, how public money becomes private influence, how influence becomes control, and how control once established becomes almost impossible to challenge from the inside. Which is why the challenge has to come from the outside, from European institutions that still have the authority and the independence to demand answers, from MEPs like Freund, who are willing to sit across from officials and read the numbers out loud, even when the officials across the table would rather be anywhere else, from journalists and investigators who haven't stopped asking even as the doors kept closing, from ordinary citizens in Hungary and across Europe who understand that this isn't an abstract Brussels dispute. It is about their money, their infrastructure, their future, because the funds that were diverted were European funds, contributed by taxpayers across the continent, allocated under rules designed to ensure they reached the people who needed them most. When those funds disappear into a network of shell contractors and nominee ownerships, it isn't just Hungary that loses, it is every citizen whose contribution was redirected away from its intended purpose. That is the argument Freund was making. Not just on behalf of Hungarian citizens who never saw the schools built or the hospitals equipped, but on behalf of the entire European project. Because if the rule of law doesn't apply to the distribution of European funds, then the rule of law is not really a rule at all. It is a suggestion, and suggestions can be ignored by anyone powerful enough to do so. Orbán has built a political identity around resisting Brussels, around framing European accountability as foreign interference, around telling his supporters that the institutions pressing for transparency are enemies of Hungarian sovereignty. That framing is powerful. It has kept him in office through multiple elections. It has given him a base that sees every investigation as an attack rather than an inquiry. But framing doesn't change numbers. And 6,200 wire transfers are not an opinion, they are a record. They exist regardless of how the story around them is told. And that is exactly why the file needs to be opened. Not to settle a political argument, but to let the evidence speak for itself, because evidence, unlike rhetoric, cannot be reframed. It can only be answered or avoided. So far, the answer has been avoidance. The file stays locked, the requests keep getting brushed off, and the hearing that should have produced clarity produced only another layer of deflection. But that hearing is now part of the record. Those numbers are now public, and the question Freund asked, the one that nobody answered, is still hanging in the air. Why are these files still locked? Every day that question goes unanswered, it gets louder, and eventually silence stops being a strategy. It becomes a confession. The money trail exists, the documents exist, the truth exists, and the people who locked it away are counting on the world to stop looking. Don't.